So, hey everyone. I don't know. I don't see many people here in the meeting, but I'm sure you might be watching this on demand. So, a very good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending upon whichever time zone you're watching this on demand. This Ask Me Anything session is part of the Festive Tech Calendar, which is being run by fellow MVPs Greg Arsuti and Richard Hooper from Europe. If you haven't checked it out, please go and check it out. Their website, they have an amazing list of content for this month, a festive month of December, and you can check out some really cool content on Azure. So today, this is the first time I'm trying to do an Ask Me Anything session on Azure governance. So me if share any feedback that you might have, but I have uh, I have come up with around 20 slides to set the context of what we can talk about Azure governance, and then probably Gregor we can answer some of the questions before wrapping up.
Yeah, I've got a list of questions for you.
Before we get started, a little introduction about me. I work as a cloud architect at Kivet Corp, based out of Omaha, Nebraska, which is in Midwest US. Thanks to Gregor, I was recently awarded Microsoft MVP in Azure. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer and I hold several Azure certifications. I run an Azure user group here based out of Omaha, where we conduct bi-weekly virtual meetings thanks to COVID. Before that, we used to have monthly meetings once a month. There you see my blog listed. You can feel free to check it out, and you can get in touch with me on my Twitter handle or on my LinkedIn profile. I think it's very important to understand what governance is all about. Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it as an act or process of governing or overseeing the control and direction of something. That something could be a country or an organization. For the purpose of this conversation or this talk, it's our Azure environment. So when we say Azure governance, it essentially means bringing an oversight on the control and direction of our Azure environments, like who is doing what in our Azure environment, why are they doing it, how much we are spending, and whatsoever. It's very important to consider so many governance constructs that Microsoft offers as part of Azure. You name it. There are so many out there now, starting with Azure Resource Manager, which is the deployment model which is being used to deploy any Azure resource in Azure today. Then Microsoft has also defined the resource hierarchy and scopes through which we can group our resources. Then we can take a step further and define our subscription and management group hierarchies to group our different Azure resources. Moving on, Azure Policies lets us define those set of rules around our Azure resources so that we can comply with our technology standards or organizational standards. We can control access to our Azure resources through what is known as Azure Role-Based Access Control. We'll talk about each one of those later in later slides. Azure Resource Graphs lets us go through different resources in a graphical API. And Azure Blueprints is what sits on top of Azure Policies, RBAC, and ARM templates, and we can essentially create our environments, recreate our environments through Azure Blueprints every time. And lastly, Azure Cost Management is another component which falls under Azure Governance. Starting with Azure Resource Manager, as I was saying, it's the central piece to the overall ecosystem. Everything that sits in Azure is an Azure Resource Manager resource. Today, there used to be classic resources, which was based on Azure Service Management, but those days are gone. Don't get surprised if you see some classic resources, but any new resource type that you can create in Azure today falls under Azure Resource Manager. The advantage you get out of it is it exposes different endpoints through PowerShell, through CLI, through REST API, or even through Azure Portal that you can provision or deprovision all those Azure Resource Manager resources. And then what you see at the lower bottom is all the different kind of resources that you can create through Azure Resource Manager. You name them. It could be a SQL database, a web app, an app service, a virtual machine, everything. Now let's talk about the resource hierarchy within Azure. As I mentioned in the uh, earlier slides, in the agenda slide, that resource groups, Microsoft defines a hierarchy for grouping our resources. At the very top level, what Microsoft recommends is to start with a management group, which provides a level of scope above everything. When we start our Azure and when we create an Azure environment, it starts with a root management group, under which every subscription that we have falls under by default, but we can have our own hierarchy of management groups. We can have nested management groups and group our subscriptions under them. Then under the management groups, we have subscriptions, which is nothing but a logical container for all our Azure resources. Each of these subscriptions are tied to a single Azure AD tenant, and it also acts as a billing boundary. We'll touch upon it in a later slide. Then the next is the resource group, which are the logical containers which are used to group related resources in a subscription. So all your resources, actual resources that you create, which is through actually goes and sits inside Azure Resource Group. Now, there you can define that hierarchy based on whatever works for your organization or for whatever way you think is best. Like in the example you are seeing here is there are two management groups under the root one. One is for prod, one is for non-prod. Under non-prod, you have dev and QA subscriptions, and then dev and QA subscription have their own dev and QA resource groups, which have the underlying dev and QA resources. Whereas under the prod management group, you have production subscription and the production resource groups and production resources. We can take it one step further and we can actually introduce our departmental management groups. For example, one management group could be for information technology, the other one could be for HR. We can further take it a level further by even introducing a hierarchy for geographies. For example, under IT, we can have South Central US and Central US. So there is literally no hard definition that Microsoft offers. It's a mechanism that we can use to group our Azure resources into a hierarchy, and it all depends upon our enterprise hierarchy, and we can group based on what works for us. One of the goals you should keep in your mind here is that it helps in your billing as well. You can group your resources for different sub departments, different teams within these hierarchies, and you can start billing them accordingly, which is one of the major benefits you get out of this hierarchy. Then you can also apply your role-based access control and your policies at each of these levels. I'll touch upon those in next few slides. Before we talk about any other thing, it's also important to understand that whenever you create an Azure subscription, it's a billing boundary, as I was mentioning earlier. There are three different ways you can avail a Azure account. One is a free account. If you don't have an Azure account, you can go and register for a free account, which gives you a $200 free credit for 1 month. And then you can also leverage certain services which are free for a year, and then there are 25 plus services which are always free. The moment you register for a free account, it creates an Azure subscription for you, which comes with that credit. The other is pay-as-you-go account, which, as the name suggests, you tie your credit card with that account, with that subscription, and whatever you consume, whatever resources you provision, you end up paying for that. Then you can also get your Azure subscription as part of Visual Studio subscriptions, which can give you $50 or $150 depending upon the level of subscription that you have. Now, if you are an enterprise customer, you might be aware of a Microsoft Online Service Program or Enterprise Agreement or Microsoft Customer Agreements. These are the different kinds of billing accounts through which Microsoft works with different enterprises to get their Azure environment set up. Whenever you create as an individual a free subscription or pay-as-you-go subscription through Azure website, it ends up under Microsoft Online Services Program. But if you are an enterprise customer, most likely you will be under either Enterprise Agreement or Microsoft Customer Agreement. Either way, that helps in whichever account type you are part of. It helps you define the pricing model for your Azure subscription. For example, as part of enterprise agreement, you might get a discounted pricing on all the Azure resources that you're going to consume in your Azure subscriptions. And under each of these agreements, you can have any number of subscriptions that you can create to create your Azure resources. Essentially, this is how it looks like. You have a billing account on top, then you have a billing profile which has multiple subscriptions under it which roll under a single invoice. And if you are an enterprise agreement customer, you can go ahead and check it out, all this hierarchy under EA portal, which is at ea.azure.com. Moving on, Azure Policies does defines a set of rules for enforcing organizational standards and assessing compliance. As I was mentioning earlier, you can literally control what's in your Azure environment, like what kind of resource types you want to allow, what kind of locations you want to allow your resources to sit in, what kind of SKUs you want to allow for your virtual machines, and kind of whatever standards you have, whatever you want to control in your environment, you can go through Azure Policies. When you're creating an Azure policy, you can either create a standalone policy, or you can also create something known as an initiative, which is nothing but a group of policies. Now, a policy can be a built-in policy. Microsoft has done a great job in providing many built-in policies, which addresses most of the common use cases. I provided a link down below. You can check out that link for the list of the built-in policies. But as a thumb rule, a policy contains 3 parts. It starts with a policy definition, which defines what rule does that policy evaluates for. Then the policy assignment defines the scope on which you assign that policy, and then you also define the policy parameters that you can pass at the time of assignments. Similarly, you can define your initiatives using definition and then assign those initiatives and pass the parameters. This is essentially what it looks like. It's as an Azure policy, it's nothing but a JSON file which starts with the different properties for the policy, starting with the display name, the policy type, if it's a built-in or a custom one. Then you can pass your parameters through your Azure policy definition. Then you define the actual rule that gets evaluated, and then you define what effect that policy has whenever that policy gets evaluated. And there are different kinds of effects that an Azure policy can have. You should be aware of that, ranging from append, audit, deny, modify, disable. Most common ones could be audit. As name suggests, it lets you audit your existing environment and gives a compliance report without making any changes in your environment. Whereas if you go with modify or deny, you can actually just not audit your environment. You can also do some remediation task and modify or delete those non-compliant resources. One interesting thing to note here is that this is the hierarchy I was showing you earlier. So when you apply a policy at a certain scope, it is automatically inherited by the underlying resources. So for example, when I have applied a policy at root management group, it gets applied at both prod and non-prod management group and the underlying subscriptions and resources. Likewise, if I apply a policy just at a prod management group, it will only apply at the prod management group level and not on the other side. Moving on, the next governance construct that I really like about is role-based access control, which lets you define the access control permissions for your Azure resources, defining who can access your resources and what access level they have. As you can see, don't get them mixed with the Azure AD roles, which are the administrator permissions on the Azure AD tenant level. There are the roles that I'm speaking here is primarily for Azure resources, which can be defined at max on a root management group level. And there are some built-in roles like owner, contributor, reader, and so on. And then you can also have resource-specific roles like virtual machine operator or a website contributor and so on. Again, it goes in line with the Azure policies, the level at which the scope at which you define or you assign that particular user to a role. the role gets inherited to the underlying hierarchy. For example, in this case, if a user is made a contributor or a owner at a root management group, the permission get inherited to all the underlying resources. Whereas if I just assign on a non-prod management group, it's only inherited by the resources under that particular management group and not by the others. Likewise, if I just assign it on a subscription, the permissions are only assigned at a subscription. If I assign specifically at a resource group or resource level, they will be inherited by, the permissions will be limited by that scope. Once we understand RBACs and policies and Azure Resource Managers, I think Blueprint starts making lots of sense. Blueprints offer a declarative way to orchestrate the deployment of artifacts, enabling quick repeatable creation of those environments. As I said, as part of a blueprint, you can have your RBAC permissions. You can also include policies that you want to apply as part of your blueprint. And you can also provide the resource groups and the ARM templates that you want to create as part of your blueprints. Pretty powerful. And do remember that each of these Azure blueprints have their own life cycle. The first step is to create and edit those blueprints, and the next step in their life cycle is to publish them. The moment you publish it, they pick up all the artifacts that you assign under a blueprint and go ahead and configure those. That might result in just not creation of resources, but also those role permissions as well as policies. Azure Resource Graph is another great construct for governance. It offers a resource exploration platform where you can query your resources and filter, sort, group them based on different properties. If you have used Azure Monitor, especially Log Analytic Workspace in the past, you would have heard of Gusto query language. So this is based on the same query language, and you can, as visible in the screenshot, you can query your resource graph through that query language and generate very meaningful insights. You can generate a dashboard, pin it to your dashboard, and even export it to Power BI. Money is the most important thing, right? Azure Cost Management is a one-stop dashboard that lets you see what's going on in your Azure environment. And I believe this is the most overlooked aspect of public cloud usage across the enterprises. They just don't realize what's going on in their Azure environment and why they are spending whatever money they are. I think greater part of the problem here is people don't understand how misleading public cloud providers have been. They say it's a pay-as-you-go model or pay-as-you-use model, but it's not like that. It's just like pay-as-you-provision. I can go ahead and provision an app service environment and just not deploy any application in there. I might not use that at all, but Microsoft will still charge me till the time my resources are running in their data center. So I think it's highly important. If anyone is really willing to go on their Azure environment, they should take costs seriously and try to bring down their costs. And I have really benefited out of this particular dashboard so much. We have identified so many resource groups and resources in our Azure environments which have not been either used or they were oversized. And we have started implementing auto scaling at so many resource groups so that we can really reduce some of the costs that we have in our Azure environment. Again, a snapshot of what we can capture in cost management. We can see accumulated costs over time. We can filter them based on resource. We can just not see monthly cost. We can also see daily cost, which gets updated within 8 to 24 hours every day. We can also filter the cost by service. We can also, if we are an enterprise customer, we can go and see invoices as part of the cost management as well. A great tool at the disposal. And if you are an enterprise which wants to take this information and generate your own insights, Microsoft does offer an Azure Cost Management connector for Power BI, through which you can, once you plug it in, you can actually export all this data from Azure Cost Management inside your Power BI, and you can generate your own dashboards and reports for your own enterprise. Tags, the most underrated or the understated resources or the governance constructs that I say. People just don't utilize them to the level they should be. And it's essentially a metadata that you can attach to your resources in Azure. Once you attach it, you can use it for grouping your resources based on those tags. You can group your resources to improve your cost reporting. The benefits are immense, and Microsoft does publishes a decision guide to help you identifying the right set of tags that you should be utilizing with your resources. And just not resources, you can actually tag your resource groups and subscriptions, and once you tag them, it behaves as a metadata, and then you can do whatever you need to, whatever kind of grouping you need to do for your resources. Pricing calculator, another tool that I think people should start utilizing. Or if you are an enterprise administrator, you can actually see your pricing based on your enterprise agreement on this pricing calculator. As a thumb rule, whenever I speak to any customer, I only recommend them, hey, before you go ahead and take a decision to provision any resource in Azure, get an estimate from pricing calculator, because that gives you a clear impression on what you are signing up for. And I think, Gregor, part of the problem here is people don't understand the OpEx model here. When we move to public cloud, we move away from capital expenditure and move towards more of an operational expenditure where we spend money every month rather than spending upfront. So pricing calculator is a great tool to understand how much we are going to end up paying on a monthly basis for whatever solution we are going to run in Azure. Azure Advisor is another great tool which we can utilize. It makes all those recommendations, as you can see in the screenshot here, around high availability, security, performance, operational excellence, and cost. If you are not aware of well-architected framework, these 5 pillars are from Azure well-architected framework. And my favorite here is cost and security. We have improved so much in our environment by just following the recommendations Azure advisors make here. Another added benefit they have provided here is what is known as an Azure Advisor score, which evaluates your Azure environments and generates a score, and you can keep improvising your environment, and your score automatically keeps improvising. I think that's a great way to track your progress on how you are improvising on your environment. Monitoring observability is one of the aspects of the public cloud, right? Whenever we are running everything in Microsoft's data center, we need visibility into what's going on in our environment. And I think Azure Monitor is a great tool that brings in that observability into our environment. If you have been using Azure since some time now, you will understand that there used to be an offering called Application Insights and Log Analytic Workspace. They have merged both the offerings inside an umbrella offering known as Azure Monitor, and essentially you can capture either metrics or log information from the variety of sources, and then you can visualize those and you can generate insights out of those telemetry and metrics and logs. So a great tool that can be helpful in your governance journey. This is Azure Advisor again. I'm trying to show here how you can see different recommendations under different sections I was showing earlier, the different pillars. For example, here I'm showing the recommendations it's making under the high availability pillar, but likewise, as you can see, the different tabs, you can go and check the recommendations for different pillars. Resource logs, again, I have heard of, and I've seen so many scenarios where people cry accidental deletion and they just don't really utilize something known as a resource log as a very simple concept where we can log our resources to prevent any accidental deletion or modification. We can have 2 types of logs, cannot delete and read only. As the name suggests, cannot delete doesn't let people delete the resources unless the person is authorized. Then likewise for read only, they can just read, they cannot delete or update. Security Center, if your governance efforts are focused more towards security, I think Azure Security Center is your tool to go. It offers a secure score, just like Azure Advisor score. It makes all the recommendations across your security posture, how you can improvise on your security posture. What you are seeing here is it gives you different kinds of recommendations. You can improvise your resources, like integrating just-in-time RDP access or threat protection or whatever it is. Azure Status, if you are not aware of, I would suggest go ahead and bookmark this page whenever there's an outage. I know this page doesn't get updated faster, but they first start posting it on Twitter. But I have this bookmark because this has been very handy whenever there is an outage. If not this, I go ahead and check what they have recently introduced, what is known as an Azure Service Health Portal, where they do keep on posting any downtimes that might happen due to any outage or planned maintenance. And a benefit we get out of Service Health dashboard is it's more of a personalized alerts for our environment. The list might go on. There is so much that we can include in Azure Governance, Azure Automation. Purview is what recently was announced for data governance. Resource Mover, which can be used to move resources. Network Watcher can be used to monitor your network. Azure Lighthouse. The list can keep going on. There are some of the links I've used in my slide deck so far. I'll probably share the slide deck with Gregor so that he can post it on the appropriate portal. And with that, I can open it up for Q&A. Gregor, if you have any questions, as you're the only one around.
Yeah, I've got some questions. Let's see what we got first. So I guess a lot of people we talk to always ask, why do you need to govern your Azure environments? So if you're not governing your environment, why should I govern my environment? What's your sort of advice on why?
I think
it's simple.
I think it's a great question. I think just like any other system or environment, Azure environment also needs certain oversight into what's happening in here. When you are spending thousands of dollars on those resources, you should know if you are deriving the right value out of that investment or not. You have to ensure that you are not paying for something that you are not using. You have to ensure that your environment is secure, ensure that no unauthorized person has access to your resources. If you are a big enterprise, then you also have to ensure that your resources are complying with those regulatory requirements. It's a big piece and often overlooked by many organizations. I think part of the problem is that people tend to think, since it's a public cloud, the governance is primary responsibility of the cloud provider, which is not correct, because it's a shared responsibility model. There are certainly things that cloud providers like Microsoft, in case of Azure, manages and oversees, but certainly there are areas which are responsibility of the consumer, where a consumer is expected to oversee and apply appropriate governance controls. I was in fact in a Gartner conference last week, and in one of the sessions they mentioned that out of all the security breaches that happen in public cloud, 99% are customers' fault. And that applies just not for security breaches, that applies for everything. If you take cost management, which is a key ingredient of cloud governance, it is on to the consumers to use the cloud in a smart way. I sometimes feel that when they say, I was mentioning earlier as well, right? When they say cloud is pay as you go, it's misleading, right? They have to understand it's not pay as you go, it's pay as you provision. So I think it's absolutely essential to have that kind of oversight into your cloud environment so that there are no surprises later.
It is. And you had some slides up showing blueprints. So what would you recommend for grouping Azure resources? I'm thinking, first of all, I see on the slide you had like a production subscription and a test subscription. Is that kind of recommended, do you think?
Oh, no, there is, as I said, there are no hard defined rules by Microsoft or anyone. It purely depends on your enterprise, what works for you. It might just be, if you are a small organization, it could just be a prod and non-prod management groups, but it might be a bigger enterprise which might have 10, 20, 100 different departments, and you can group your management groups based on those departments, and you should consider different considerations. For example, how do you want to apply access control across those subscriptions? How do you want to charge back or show back the cost for those subscriptions? How do you want to apply policies? Does all your policies be same for all the departments, which I believe is not going to be the same. So I think those are some of the decisions which have different answers for different organizations. So to answer a question in a single line, no, there is not defined a way to do that, but it's
okay. And what about Azure resources? Should you put them all in one single resource group, or do you split them out? What do you tend to do? Do you have different types of? Sorry, do you have several resource groups, or do you plant them all in the one?
There is no hard defined rule which says you cannot place all your resources within a single Azure resource group. But again, similar to how management groups and subscriptions should be designed, you should also design your resource group so that you can group your resources for same project within a single resource groups. That way you can isolate them, because resource groups are nothing but a logical containers for your resources. Essentially, you don't really pay anything for creating those logical constructs. At the end of the day, you are paying for the underlying resources to have a better management and not to increase your management overhead. I think it makes perfect sense to group your resources into different resource groups based on your projects or your solutions, or so that they are easy to manage, and each resource group has its own life cycle. So you can create all the resources within the resource group and you can delete them together as part of the resource group. You have to take care of that as well. So I think I would certainly not go with a single large resource group having all the resources, but it's a balance how you define how you break your applications and your workloads in your enterprise. And I believe each workload and each application should have its own resource group.
Okay, cool. You had a slide up on management groups. Is there any limits on the number of management groups you can create?
And that's a good question. There is a limit of, I believe the limit is 10,000 management groups that we can create at maximum, which I think practically is a very high number. There would not be any organization who will end up having 10,000 management groups. And if there is an organization who has 10,000 management groups, I think those management groups will be totally unmanaged. Yeah. So I think virtually we cannot hit that limit, but it's again a balance. We should not end up having so many management groups that it results in a management overhead. So we should design our hierarchy in such a way so that it's easier for us to manage and apply those governance controls on them.
What's the best way to organize subscriptions if you're using management groups, do you think?
I think the easiest and the best way that works for most of the organizations is based on the departments. If not departments, it's what I've seen works for most of the organizations is based on the environment, if like the prod versus non-prod, or it's based on the department. So strictly as a no-no, the best practice I can recommend is never put your prod and non-prod resources under the same management group and same subscription. That's the basic rule. But over and above that, it depends how many workloads you're going to run in Azure, and based on that, you should define if you need a further management group for department or geographies or.
Yeah. You also talked about Azure Policy. So where I work, we have some Azure policies in place that don't allow us to deploy certain size of virtual machines and things like that. What's the main difference between Azure Policy exceptions and Azure Policy exemptions? What's the kind of difference between those two?
Great question. So whenever we are creating an Azure policy, as I was saying in one of the slides, that policy has three portions to it. it starts with a policy definition, then it goes with policy assignment, and then it goes with policy parameters. So in policy assignments, when you are assigning a policy to a scope, the scope could be a management group or a subscription or a resource group or a resource. You can actually add exception to that scope, meaning if I want to apply a policy at a subscription level, but I want to add a resource group as an exception so that that policy doesn't get applied at all to that exception scope. That is where exceptions came into picture. But recently Microsoft has announced something known as policy exemptions. I believe it was back in September at Ignite. What it lets you do is, if the exceptions never show up in your compliance reports when you're running your policy, how many were excluded, it only shows reports on your included resources. So when you include policy exemptions, it lets you show that in your non-compliance report as well. That's one of the major benefits I have seen. For example, there might be resources or resource groups or scope. There will be a scope where I don't want my policy to be applied today, or I want a temporary waiver for some time. That is where policy exemptions come into place, where we can, as part of our assignment, we can include certain exemptions, most likely for a temporary period, like a year or two, and then we can see that exemption as part of our compliance report. But do note that it's right now it's free, but looks like Microsoft is going to charge for those, adding those policy exemptions, and policy exceptions are free.
Okay. So if I'm kind of new to Azure and my company's new to Azure, you kind of talked about RBAC, role-based access control. What's kind of best practices for me getting started?
I think it's, if you are an administrator or...
Yeah. I imagine I'm the guy in charge and I'm looking after my company's.
So I would strongly suggest you to follow the least privilege principle, regardless of Azure RBAC or even for Azure AD roles. One of the things you should check out is custom roles. And Microsoft has done a great job in providing built-in roles specific to different resources. For example, you name a resource type and they have a built-in role. If you want a specific role for Cosmos DB, they have a Cosmos DB contributor. If it's a virtual machine, they have virtual machine contributor, virtual machine operator, which comes with those specific permissions required for those specific resource types. But if you are newbie to Azure, I would strongly recommend you to not go and start providing or giving people contributor and owner permissions at resource groups or virtually any scope, because the problem is if owners and contributors literally have way too many permissions than what most of the people need. So always start with lesser permissions, give people the permissions at resources, resource specific roles, like, as I said, Cosmos DB contributor or SQL DB contributor, whatever specific permission that they need. Unless there is a real need that someone really needs to be a contributor and owner, just don't do it. That's one of the best practices that I always follow. I just don't literally go with an idea that anyone needs contributor or owner permissions. And you do understand difference between owner and contributor. They are virtually God. They have virtually God permissions. They can do anything. The only thing contributor cannot do is the person cannot assign permissions to others, whereas an owner can do so. That's the only difference.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. Definitely, I've seen a lot of companies where we look at their Azure environment and everyone's an owner.
and one thing you can also look out for is, which I'm trying to get established, is privileged identity management. So if you are aware of Azure AD tenant, you will be aware of privileged identity manager, where you can make people elevate their permissions temporarily. For example, for global administrators and other administrators, you can leverage PIM to elevate those permissions. Then now you can also use PIM with your Azure roles. So, which is a great addition, because now if you still end up providing contributor and owner permissions, you can actually utilize PIM so that people can elevate their permission as and when they need temporarily. And you can also include approval workflows in that PIM, which is great. And as a thumb rule, another thing I would recommend you is if someone is planning to go and provision resources in Azure portal directly, it's a strict no-no for me.
Yeah.
I don't really recommend that. I would recommend they should use automation and get it deployed from there rather than. Yes, that's.
So let's change tack a wee bit and talk about cost management. I think this is a very important thing. I always tweet it out at the start of every month. Can everyone go and please check their costs? Just as a reminder, in case anyone gets a horrible nasty bill. Have you ever set up cost budgets within cost management?
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about them.
Oh yeah, cost budgets are super nice. It's when was it added? I think they introduced it a couple of years back, I believe. I think a strong addition to the overall Azure cost management. The benefit. Hold on, am I still sharing my screen?
Let me check for you. Nope.
Yeah, it works now. I can see you now. I stopped sharing screen. So yeah, so budgets are super powerful. You can assign those budgets at your different scopes. It could be resource groups, it could be subscriptions, it could be I believe we cannot assign it at resources the last time I checked, but what it really ensures is you can assign a budget amount and you can then set up alerts on top of those budgets as and when those budget amounts are breached. You can set percentages if your spend is reaching 50% or 75% or 100%, or it has already crossed your budget amount. You can set alerts, and it's based on action groups and alert rules. So you can just not send emails or SMSs to people. You can actually trigger an Azure function or a logic app, or you can actually trigger an Azure automation runbook and shut down your virtual machines, or you can virtually, the possibilities are immense because then it's all based on action groups and alert rules framework. But budgets are great. They have recently, I'm not sure, Gregor, if you had a look, but they have introduced something known as cost alerts as well, which is under preview right now. I haven't got a chance to play a lot around those, but I understand they are taking the next step in that direction of budgets, where earlier in budgets, we were supposed to create those alerts on our own. Yeah. Now using those cost alerts, we can just, it's a button click and we should be able to configure those alerts.
Yeah, now you've got budget alerts, credit alerts, and department spending quota alerts. So they've set the idea up that if you're nearing your budget, so say you set a budget of, let's just say $5,000 a month or $500 a month, let's say, and you're heading towards that, it works out that you're going to go over your budget before the end of the month based on the trend, and you can set up to send you an email or send a message out and alert people that you're heading towards reaching your budget.
Absolutely.
And it's the same for, you might have an Azure credit balance. You can set up to say, send me an email if it's like 90% of my budget's used up.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. That, along with what we were talking about, the budgets, it's pretty powerful stuff. It's good stuff. Keeps you in the right.
It is good stuff. And
yeah. What about resource graph? You talked about that. Have you done much with resource graph?
I have not used resource graph extensively, but I do understand resource graph and it's the power it brings. What question do you have? I can give it a shot.
No, I was just going to ask, have you done anything with like dashboards or anything like that?
I have. So I will probably post a link to some of the sample dashboards if you have a chance. I don't know if you have looked at them, but when I was learning about resource graph, there is a GitHub repo. There is a gentleman who has published some of those dashboards, which is super helpful. And I was learning my resource graph. I was doing my resource graph learning through that dashboard. So you can actually build your resource graph queries, and on top of that, you can generate charts, and then you can pin them to your dashboard. I'll probably have to pull that. I utilize a couple of sample dashboards that that gentleman has published, which gives you everything ranging from how many resources you have in your environment, how many virtual machines you have, how many Windows virtual machines you have, how many Linux virtual machines you have, how many storage accounts you have, what is the total capacity of your storage accounts, how many do you have in central US, how many resources you have in south central, how many you have in Europe. It gives all that visibility, and it all runs on those crystal queries uh, written in the resource queries that they have written in Azure Resource Graph.
What about you're talking quite a bit about blueprints. It's not something I've really looked at. Are they still widely used? Do you use them yourself?
No, we have tried to identify a use case for blueprints, but I have so far understood that if there is an organization who are creating an environment from scratch,
Yeah.
is where blueprints are super helpful, because it gives you that starting point where you can have and establish your environment in a state from where you can take it forward to. But where I work for, we already have our Azure environment set up years back. So, and we have struggled really to see a benefit of utilizing Azure Blueprints, how we can introduce them. But the major benefit is, if we cannot use Azure Blueprints directly, Azure Blueprints is nothing but it's a mix of role-based access control, permissions, and policies, and ARM templates. And we have been trying to use each of these underlying technologies separately rather than clubbing them inside a single blueprint and doing it. But Azure Blueprints are super powerful if you are working on creating landing zones and your own environments. You can create your own blueprints, and then you can, in a repeatable way, you can keep on creating those environments on the fly.
Okay.
They are still in preview. They're still in preview. Hopefully they'll go out of preview next year.
So if we go back to kind of very simple, a company starting to use Azure for the first time, who's responsible for deploying the resources, do you think? How do you go about getting started?
Can you repeat it once?
Yeah, sorry. So imagine I am a brand new customer and I am setting up my environment for the very first time. I'm totally new to Azure. Who kind of in the company should be responsible for deploying the solution and managing the environment, setting up the subscription and tenants and stuff like that? Can governance help me with that kind of stuff?
Interesting question. So
I think a lot of people struggle with how to get started.
I think to get started, it's what I would recommend is they should identify a dedicated cloud team who at least understand some basics of Azure. If not, they should get themselves trained. Yeah. And because the problem is, I have seen organizations where they start with Azure without any understanding of what it is about, and sooner or later they realize that they have got that cloud sprawl where they have so much of the resources spread out and nothing is planned. They don't had any plans in there. So I think it's better to take a step back and form a cloud team, get a few folks in the team, train them on Azure. And again, cloud is tightly linked to your DevOps culture as well. I have seen teams who don't change their culture from isolated development and operations team. They still operate. They still have developers. They still have system administrators, and they expect one of those teams to go ahead and start managing their Azure environments, which actually sometimes doesn't work, because you have to cloud, and I believe public cloud and DevOps go hand in hand. So you have to bring in that cultural change and start looking at things in a different way.
Yeah, totally agree. What about Azure Advisor? So we showed us a slide with some recommendations. Should I always follow those recommendations, or is there some that I don't need to worry about, or what's your advice on that?
Absolutely no. They are not meant to be followed 100%. They are just recommendations. So it might make sense to you. It might not make sense. So do what makes sense to you. For example, it might ask you to go and buy reservations because it might see historical trends of your usage, but you might already have visibility into that capacity, and you might be aware that that capacity is gonna be anyways be deleted, or those resources are gonna be deprovisioned sooner or later. So don't go with as a grain of salt that it's, if they are recommending, that's the right thing, that's the only right thing to do. They are just recommendations, so feel free to accept them or ignore them.
Yeah, I think the same goes for Security Center.
Absolutely.
As well. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, sometimes I think people just click on it and see, right, I better apply all these, but they don't always make sense. Interesting. So what about Azure Lighthouse? Tell us a little bit about that.
Azure what?
Lighthouse.
Lighthouse. I have not explored Azure Lighthouse a lot. Have you? Have you explored Azure?
So yeah, we actually use it to manage our customers. So we're a CSP, and I'm an Azure Expert MSP. So we have to look at.
I believe it's for cross-tenant management, right?
Yeah. So we can log in and look at all the different customers' tenants using Lighthouse. So it's really quite good. It's really powerful. It saves us creating accounts. So one of the things you talked about was like account sprawl as well, which is I don't want to be an owner on all of our customers' tenants. And they don't want me to be an owner on all of our customers' tenants. So we can use Lighthouse to log in and change the subscriptions and the tenants and things like that. So yeah,
it makes the work for CSP so easy, right? Then
much easier. Yeah, it's pretty good.
Unfortunately, that's the pretty much knowledge I have about Lighthouse, that we can do cross-tenant. Having played around with it a lot.
It's good for that. What else can I ask? Talk to me about kind of I can't say this word, regulatory compliance requirements. So what can I get out of from Azure? What sort of compliance do they give me already?
I think that if you speak of Azure Policies, Azure Security Center, they do provide different built-in controls specific for different regulatory compliance like HIPAA or NIST or FedRAMP. But outside that, another thing I can recommend you is go and check out Azure Trust Center, which will also be helpful. And now when you say of regulatory compliance, there could be different areas, right? It could be industry-specific compliance that you have to comply with, or it might be a geographical restriction that you might have, that your data might not sit outside United States. So I think Azure Policies, Azure Security Center, Azure Trust Center, some good resources to start with.
Yeah, what's your thoughts on infrastructure as code to deploy the resources? Have you got a thought on that? It's not really a governance topic, but what's your thoughts around that?
Another interesting thing, I mean, infrastructure as code. The major struggle I've seen with infrastructure as code is every organization have their own definition for infrastructure as code, and essentially in my mind it's as simple as deploying your infrastructure just through code, and I call it ephemeral environments, and I believe we should target for that in public cloud, because the moment for every second your resources are running in Azure that you are not using, that money you are getting, it's wasted, right? Because that's not being used, but provider is still going to charge you for. So I think infrastructure as code is very powerful, and there are that's where I think one of the things that really come very handy is Azure Policies.
Yeah.
Because infrastructure as code could be abused or misused, because the service principles that it uses might be very powerful. People can go ahead and provision things that they're not supposed to. And that's where I believe Azure Policies come super handy, where you can control what kind of resource types can be provisioned, what locations the resources can be provisioned, what kind of SKUs that for each resource type can be provisioned for.
Yeah. I think Azure Policies is key to quite a lot of this. We use Azure Policy to enforce tagging, which you mentioned earlier. We see a lot of customers where you log on to their environment and they haven't tagged it, and it's really difficult to work out cost management.
Absolutely.
There's different departments, and it's all
One of
all
the
the
challenge,
resources.
one of the challenges I have seen with tagging is it doesn't update the historical tags
Yeah.
in cost management. So the moment you update tags, your future costs will be linked to that tag, but it will never move the historical cost for those resources to these tags. And I did try to inquire about that. The reason I came to know is it's because once it goes into invoice, it's done. They don't touch it. They don't modify it at all.
So we always apply a policy of you must put tags on any resource.
And that's where it becomes so critical to have those policies up front before you start rolling out some of those resources, because once your resources are provisioned, you haven't tagged them. Sooner or later, whenever you will tag them, you can't map your historical cost to them.
Absolutely. I don't think I've got any more questions for you on governance, to be honest.
Good stuff. It's 1 or 2. I mean, it's the 1 hour is gone.
Yeah, that was good. I enjoyed that. I like talking about governance. It's one of my favorite things, actually.
Yeah, and my 2020 has been focused purely on Azure governance. I have done so much of readings, tried so many things. I think it's the most underrated thing people just overlook.
Yeah, I'm lucky where I work. We have a team that basically, if we have a new customer, we have like a template of all the governance, so we just deploy it to their environment, and it takes care of itself. And we set up all the budgets and the layouts and all that, and it's beautiful. We don't really need to do much. We just roll out that template, and away we go.
All right.
Very nice. Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed this. This has been good.
It was a great conversation, Gregor. So let me go ahead and stop the recording.